In Sparta, birth was not a celebration. It was an examination. Where other cities welcomed life, Sparta measured it, weighing its worth against the survival of the state. Nestled in the mountains of Laconia, this city valued strength above all. Its people believed that endurance was sacred and weakness unforgivable. From the moment a Spartan child took his first breath, he belonged not to his parents, but to the city. Within days, every newborn was carried before the Gerousia, the council of aged warriors. They inspected the infant's frame, searching for signs of strength. A healthy body meant acceptance. A frail one meant silence, the kind of silence only Sparta could justify. To outsiders, this seemed merciless. To Spartans, it was order. They believed that mercy bred fragility, and fragility endangered all. Only the fit would endure, and through them, the city would live forever. Those who survived were raised not with affection, but with purpose. Parents taught their children obedience before speech, control before comfort. Mothers hardened their hearts, for they knew their sons were destined for war. They were told that true love was not protection, it was preparation. Fathers, too, shaped their sons into stone. Their homes were barren. No luxuries, no indulgence, only discipline. The words of Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver, ruled even within the household. No act for the self, every act for Sparta. Women trained their bodies as fiercely as men, for their duty was to give birth to the strong. Their pride was silent, their measure of love, the sons they sent to serve. Before battle, they would say one command: return with your shield, or on it. Life in Sparta was devotion to discipline. Children ate in silence, walked barefoot on cold stone, and learned early that pain was not the enemy, weakness was. Every hardship was a lesson, every comfort a threat. By the age of 7, childhood was over. The boy was taken from his home and entered the Agoge, the brutal institution that would strip him of innocence and forge him into iron. But even before that day, Sparta had already shaped him. He had learned obedience, silence, and control. He was no longer a child. He was the property of a state that worshipped perfection. In Sparta, the body was a tool, the soul a weapon, and the purpose of life service to the city. They were not raised as sons. They were built as soldiers. At the age of 7, a Spartan boy's childhood ended. He was taken from his family, not as punishment, but as destiny. The state claimed him now, as it had claimed generations before. This was the beginning of the Agoge, Sparta's ruthless training system, the machine that transformed children into soldiers and soldiers into legends. The Agoge was not a school, it was a crucible. There were no desks, no lessons of poetry or philosophy. Its purpose was simple: to erase weakness and build obedience. From sunrise to sunset, boys were drilled, disciplined, and deprived. Hunger was their teacher. Pain was their language. Silence, their only form of pride. Each morning began with a test of endurance. They ran barefoot across fields of frost, bathed in cold rivers, and marched in silence through rocky terrain. Their food was deliberately scarce, just enough to survive, never enough to feel full. If they wanted more, they were encouraged to steal, not as rebellion, but as training in cunning. If caught, they were beaten, not for theft, but for being foolish enough to get caught. The state demanded resourcefulness without mercy. Every act, every punishment, was a lesson. Discomfort became their companion, and hardship their home. As the years passed, the boys grew lean, scarred, and silent. Their bodies hardened, their emotions numbed. They slept on beds woven from reeds they gathered themselves. They spoke only when commanded, and even then, their words were measured, sharp, deliberate. Among them, friendships were forged not through affection, but through shared endurance. Pain bound them together more tightly than love ever could. The Agoge did not raise individuals. It created a brotherhood of discipline. The instructors, men who had survived the same trials, watched without pity. They struck swiftly, corrected ruthlessly, and rewarded nothing but excellence. Failure was not punished, it was simply erased. Those who faltered too often vanished quietly, their absence unspoken, their names forgotten. At night, the boys huddled beneath open skies, their stomachs empty, their spirits thin, yet their pride unbroken. They whispered the maxims of Lycurgus, words that echoed through the generations. Obedience, endurance, victory. To outsiders, the Agoge was cruelty. To Spartans, it was creation, a process that stripped away all softness, until only strength remained. By the time they reached manhood, they had become more than soldiers. They were living instruments of the state, forged by pain, sharpened by silence, and tempered in the fire of discipline. In Sparta, childhood ended at 7, and what replaced it was not innocence, but purpose. By their teens, the boys of Sparta no longer resembled children. They were shadows in motion, lean, alert, unblinking. Years of hunger and silence had stripped away softness. What remained was instinct. The Agoge had done its work. Now came the transformation from endurance to dominance. They were taught to hunt, not for sport, but for survival. In the forests beyond the city, they tracked animals with bare feet and sharpened sticks, learning to move unseen, to strike without hesitation. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of light was a lesson in awareness. But the true hunt was not for prey. It was for mastery of the body, the will, and the fear that still lingered beneath the discipline. To hesitate was failure. To act without control was weakness. Only balance created the perfect weapon. They wrestled on dust fields beneath the burning sun, their skins streaked with sweat and sand. Each throw a rehearsal for combat, each bruise a mark of progress. Pain no longer hurt, it confirmed existence. At dusk, they gathered in silence, faces expressionless, eyes fixed on the horizon. They were no longer trained to obey. They were trained to anticipate, to read an enemy before he moved, to sense danger before it arrived. The Agoge had refined them beyond soldiers. It had created predators, creatures of instinct and intellect combined, hardened by deprivation, sharpened by unity. They spoke little, trusted only those who endured beside them, and learned that in Sparta, mercy was a language of the defeated. Music swells, deep brass and choir blend. When the instructors looked upon them, they no longer saw boys, but weapons, precise, silent, and loyal to the state alone. Sparta had achieved its purpose. It had taught them not just how to fight, but how to live without fear. They were no longer human in the ordinary sense. They were the embodiment of discipline, the Macon. By now, the boys had learned to survive pain. But Sparta demanded more, not just endurance, but transcendence. The next stage of their making would test not the body, but the spirit itself. They called it the trial of blood and silence, a ritual older than memory, performed at the altar of Artemis Orthia, the goddess who watched over their transformation. It was here that boys became warriors. In the pale light of dawn, each youth stood before the altar, his face expressionless, his eyes hollow yet unbroken. Cheese offerings were placed on the sacred stone, but they were never the true prize. To reach the altar, the boys had to run through a corridor of whips, a gauntlet of pain, where older warriors waited in silence. Each lash tore flesh, but crying out meant disgrace. To endure without sound, that was the victory. Sparta measured manhood not in years, but in the ability to suffer beautifully. Some collapsed, some fell unconscious, and some, in rare, whispered stories, died smiling. For in death, they found honor. In agony, they found belonging. The city watched, not in pity, but in reverence. This was their faith, pain as purification, discipline as divinity. Those who endured the longest were hailed as paragons of Spartan virtue, their scars seen as medals, their silence immortal. When the ritual ended, the survivors stood bloodless, trembling, but proud. Their eyes no longer feared the lash, nor the battle that awaited them. They had mastered pain, and in mastering it, they had mastered themselves. The trial of blood and silence was not cruelty. It was Sparta's prayer, a hymn to strength, sung without words. When the body had been hardened and the will tempered, Sparta delivered its final lesson, solitude. This was the shadow test, a silent journey where a boy ceased to exist as a child and emerged as a weapon of the state. He was sent into the wilderness alone, armed with nothing but a cloak, a dagger, and the knowledge that failure meant disappearance. The mountains of Laconia stretched endless before him, cold, wild, and merciless. There, he would live like a ghost, feeding on what he could find, hunting under moonlight, and watching for eyes that hunted him in return. The test was not of survival alone. It was of cunning, restraint, and precision. He was taught to vanish within the land, to blend into its silence, to kill when commanded, not from rage, but from reason. It was said that those who returned did so with a gaze that never blinked again. They had learned to breathe like predators, to walk as shadows, and to think only in terms of victory or extinction. But the wilderness held more than hunger. At times, a boy was commanded to spill blood, not of beasts, but of enemies of the state, the weak, the disobedient, those who whispered rebellion. It was not murder, it was duty. And through that act, the state saw proof that mercy had been erased from the heart. When he returned, he was changed. No celebration greeted him, no feast or embrace, only the approving silence of his masters, and the understanding that he no longer belonged to himself. The shadow test was not meant to see who could live. It was meant to prove who could kill, and still remain calm in the darkness. When the boys returned from the wilderness, they were no longer alone. Each one had faced death and found silence in its gaze. Now, they were forged together in the final phase of the Agoge, the Brotherhood. They trained, ate, and bled side by side, their lives bound by discipline, not affection. Pain was no longer an obstacle but a language, a way to measure loyalty and strength. Their instructors watched from the shadows, demanding perfection in every motion, every breath. A single failure was shared by all, a single triumph earned together. In these barracks of endurance, friendship was forged not by words, but by scars. Each Spartan learned one truth. Alone he could endure, but together he could conquer. By now, the Spartan had become the state's ideal, a body without hesitation, a mind without doubt. But perfection demanded payment. To preserve their purity, Sparta bred exclusivity. Every warrior lost in battle was irreplaceable, each death a fracture in the city's iron heart. As their numbers fell, the very strength they worshipped began to consume them. Discipline turned to rigidity, virtue to obsession. Sparta had created soldiers who could obey, but not question. When new wars came, innovation faltered, and their flawless order became a cage. In chasing immortality, they forged fragility. Their greatest victory, mastery over weakness, became their doom. For nothing made of flesh or will can remain perfect forever. Sparta's strength once echoed across Greece, but pride became its undoing. At Leuctra, their perfect phalanx shattered. Discipline met innovation and broke. The Iron City bled, its warriors fallen, its legacy cracked. Wealth replaced duty. Luxury corroded iron. The empire that feared weakness was destroyed not by others, but by itself. Though Sparta fell, its spirit never truly died. The discipline that once bound its warriors became legend, a standard whispered through centuries. Generals studied their formations, philosophers admired their order, and nations borrowed their creed. That strength is born not of comfort, but of struggle. Yet the forge that built Sparta also warns us. Perfection without compassion corrodes the soul. Power without purpose devours itself. The Spartans taught the world endurance, but also revealed the cost of becoming unbreakable. Wind carries faint echoes of marching feet. In every army, every discipline, their shadow endures, not as conquest, but as memory. For the forge that made them still burns, not in stone or steel, but in the human will to endure.